Captain Sarah Mitchell stood at attention in the sterile conference room, her uniform crisp despite the weight of defeat pressing down on her shoulders. The disciplinary board consisted of 3 stone-faced colonels, each one representing years of military tradition that she had apparently failed to uphold. Captain Mitchell, Colonel Harrison's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Your actions during Operation Desert Shield resulted in the loss of classified intelligence and compromised the safety of your entire unit. Do you have anything to say in your defense? Sarah's jaw tightened. She had said everything already, explained the impossible situation she faced, the choice between following orders that would have meant civilian casualties or protecting innocent lives. The board didn't want to hear about the children in that village, about the families caught in the crossfire, about the intelligence that was deliberately false. No, sir, she replied, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her chest. Colonel Martinez leaned forward, his weathered face showing no emotion. Captain, you graduated top of your class from West Point. You served with distinction for 8 years. Your record was spotless until this incident. What happened out there? Sarah closed her eyes briefly, remembering the heat of the desert sun, the sound of helicopters overhead, and the moment she realized the intelligence they were acting on was completely wrong. The supposed weapons cache was actually a school. The enemy combatants were teachers trying to protect their students. I made a judgment call, sir, she said quietly. A judgment call that cost us a strategic advantage and put American lives at risk, Colonel Harrison snapped. Your subordinates followed your lead, Captain. When you refused the direct order to advance, you didn't just compromise yourself. You compromised them too. The weight of those words hit harder than any physical blow. Sarah thought about Sergeant Davis, barely 22 years old, who had looked to her for guidance. She remembered Private Johnson, who had just become a father, trusting her decision completely. They had all followed her when she called the retreat, believing in her leadership even when headquarters was screaming orders through the radio. Those men and women trusted you, Colonel Martinez continued, and your decision to retreat without authorization left our allies exposed. The enemy regrouped and launched a counterattack that resulted in significant casualties. Sarah's hands remained clasped behind her back, but her knuckles were white with tension. She knew the casualties weren't her fault directly, but command needed someone to blame. The false intelligence had come from higher up, from sources she couldn't question publicly without destroying her career and potentially compromising ongoing operations. The intelligence was flawed, she said carefully, knowing she was walking a dangerous line. Intelligence is often incomplete, Captain, Colonel Harrison replied coldly. That's why we have officers capable of making difficult decisions under pressure. Your job wasn't to second-guess command. Your job was to follow orders. The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Sarah stared straight ahead, her military training keeping her posture perfect even as her world crumbled around her. She had known this moment was coming for weeks, ever since she was pulled from active duty and subjected to investigation after investigation. Colonel Martinez opened a folder and read from it without emotion. Captain Sarah Mitchell, you are hereby relieved of your command and discharged from the United States Army under other than honorable conditions. You will surrender all military property and identification immediately. The words echoed in Sarah's mind like gunshots. 8 years of service, 8 years of dedication, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to protecting others, reduced to a single moment of moral clarity that her superiors saw as insubordination. Your discharge will be effective immediately, Colonel Harrison added. You have 24 hours to clear your quarters and leave the base. Security will escort you to ensure compliance. Sarah removed her captain's bars with steady hands, placing them on the table with a soft click that seemed to reverberate through the room. The weight of her uniform felt different now, no longer a symbol of honor and service, but a reminder of everything she was losing. As she walked out of the conference room, flanked by 2 military police officers, Sarah could feel the eyes of other soldiers on her. Word traveled fast on military bases, and by now everyone knew about her disgrace. Some looked away in embarrassment, others stared with curiosity or judgment. A few nodded slightly, understanding in their eyes that spoke of their own difficult moments when orders conflicted with conscience. Her quarters were sparse, accumulated belongings from 8 years of military life fitting into just 3 boxes. Photos of her unit, commendations, letters from grateful families whose lives had been touched by her service. All of it now felt like artifact from someone else's life. Sarah packed methodically, her training keeping her focused on the task, even as her mind reeled with uncertainty about the future. Sergeant Rodriguez appeared in her doorway, looking around nervously before stepping inside. "Captain, I just wanted to say that what you did out there, what you chose, we all knew it was right. We were there. We saw what would have happened if we had followed those orders." Sarah looked up from her packing, touched by the loyalty, but concerned for the young sergeant's career. "Rodriguez, you need to be careful. Don't let my situation affect your standing here." "Ma'am, with respect, some things are more important than standing," Rodriguez replied firmly. "You saved lives that day. Civilian lives, and probably ours too. Command can label it however they want, but we know the truth." After Rodriguez left, Sarah continued packing in silence. The military had been her entire adult life, her identity, her purpose. She had enlisted straight out of high school, driven by a desire to serve something greater than herself. The Army had given her structure, brotherhood, and a clear mission. Now she faced civilian life with no clear direction and a discharge that would make finding meaningful work incredibly difficult. The next morning, Sarah loaded her boxes into her old Honda Civic, a car that had sat in use for months while she lived on base. The security escort watched impassively as she signed final paperwork and surrendered her military identification. The guard at the gate barely looked up as she drove through for the last time, the barrier lifting to release her into an uncertain future. The drive away from Fort Campbell felt surreal. Sarah had imagined leaving the Army many times, but always with honor, perhaps retiring after 20 years of service with a ceremony and the respect of her peers. Instead, she was leaving in disgrace, her reputation destroyed, her career in ruins. She drove aimlessly for hours, not ready to face the small apartment she had rented in town while looking for civilian employment. The transition to civilian life was jarring after years of military structure and purpose. There were no morning formations, no clear objectives, no mission to accomplish. Just endless days of job applications that went nowhere and interviews that ended when prospective employers saw her discharge status. Sarah found work at a small security company, a job that paid a fraction of her military salary and utilized none of her leadership skills or tactical expertise. Her supervisor, a former police officer named Mike Chun, was sympathetic but couldn't offer much beyond basic security guard positions. The work was mind-numbing, checking identification badges, monitoring security cameras, writing reports about incidents that rarely happened. The hardest part wasn't the reduction in pay or status. It was the isolation. For years, Sarah had been part of a tight-knit military community where everyone understood the sacrifices and challenges of service. Now she was surrounded by civilians who viewed her discharge with suspicion or pity, assuming she had done something truly terrible to merit such treatment. Months passed in a blur of routine and regret. Sarah rented a studio apartment in a rough part of town, spending her evenings reading military history and following news about conflicts overseas. She watched as her former unit was redeployed, wondering about the soldiers she had trained and led, hoping they were safe and well led under their new commander. The nightmares came frequently, not about combat, but about the choice she had made and its consequences. She would dream about alternative scenarios where she had followed orders, where American soldiers died because of faulty intelligence, where innocent civilians were killed because she prioritized following commands over protecting lives. In these dreams, she saw the faces of children who would have died if she had acted differently, but she also saw the disappointed faces of her fellow soldiers who paid the price for her moral stand. Dr. Patricia Wells, the Veterans Affairs counselor assigned to Sarah's case, tried to help her process the complex emotions surrounding her discharge. Moral injury is real, Dr. Wells explained during one of their sessions. When your personal ethics conflict with institutional demands, it creates a wound that's difficult to heal. You made a choice that saved lives, but the system punished you for it. That contradiction is devastating to process. Sarah appreciated the counseling, but it didn't change her practical reality. She was a disgraced former officer with limited prospects and a growing sense of purposelessness. The skills that had made her an exceptional military leader, tactical thinking, crisis management, the ability to make difficult decisions under pressure, seemed irrelevant in civilian life. The call came on a Tuesday evening while Sarah was heating up a frozen dinner and watching the news. The voice on the other end was familiar but unexpected. Colonel Martinez, one of the officers who had presided over her discharge hearing. "Captain Mitchell," he said, using her former rank despite her civilian status. "I need to speak with you. Can you come to Fort Campbell tomorrow morning? There's been a development regarding your former unit." Sarah's heart rate increased immediately. "What kind of development, sir?" "I can't discuss it over the phone," Martinez replied. "But, Captain, this is important. Your country may need you again." The line went dead, leaving Sarah staring at her phone in confusion and growing anxiety. Whatever had happened to her unit, it was serious enough for the military to contact a disgraced former officer. Despite everything they had put her through, despite the way they had destroyed her career and reputation, they were reaching out to her now. Sarah barely slept that night, her mind racing through possibilities. Had her unit been captured? Were they facing a situation that required her specific knowledge or expertise? The military didn't make contact with discharged officers unless the circumstances were extraordinary. As she drove toward Fort Campbell the next morning, Sarah felt a familiar mixture of dread and anticipation. The base looked exactly the same, but she was returning as a visitor rather than a member of the military family. The guard at the gate checked her identification multiple times before allowing her entry, and she was assigned an escort to ensure she didn't wander into restricted areas. Colonel Martinez met her in the same conference room where her military career had ended 6 months earlier. He looked older, more worn, with stress lines that hadn't been there before. The confidence and authority that had characterized their previous meeting were replaced by something that looked almost like desperation. "Thank you for coming, Captain," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "I know this is unusual, given our history, but the situation is unprecedented." Sarah remained standing, her posture automatically shifting into military bearing despite her civilian clothes. "What's happened to my unit, sir?" Martinez opened a classified folder and spread photographs across the table. Sarah recognized the terrain immediately. It was the same region where her controversial decision had taken place months earlier. But something was different about these images. The landscape looked devastated, with destroyed buildings and evidence of significant military activity. 3 days ago, your former unit was deployed to extract a high-value target from this area, Martinez began. The intelligence indicated minimal resistance and a straightforward extraction operation. They were wrong. Sarah studied the photographs more carefully, her tactical mind automatically analyzing the terrain and evidence of combat. What kind of resistance did they encounter? The target was a trap, Martinez admitted. The entire operation was compromised from the beginning. Your former unit is now surrounded and cut off from support. 12 soldiers, including Sergeant Davis and Private Johnson, are trapped in hostile territory with limited ammunition and no clear extraction route. The names hit Sarah like physical blows. Davis and Johnson were among the soldiers who had followed her retreat order 6 months earlier, who had trusted her judgment even when it meant defying direct commands. Now, they were in mortal danger because of another intelligence failure. Every rescue attempt has failed, Martinez continued. We've lost 2 helicopters and 6 additional soldiers trying to extract them. The enemy knows our tactics, our procedures, our typical response patterns. They prepared for everything we might try. Sarah's mind was already working through the tactical challenges, analyzing the terrain and considering unconventional approaches. But she forced herself to remain focused on the most important question. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked quietly. Martinez met her eyes directly for the first time since she had entered the room. "Because you know the terrain better than anyone else still available. You know the local population, the cultural dynamics, the hidden routes that aren't on our maps. And because—" He paused, clearly struggling with the admission. "Because your unconventional thinking might be the only thing that can save them." The irony was bitter and overwhelming. The same unconventional thinking that had led to her disgrace was now being viewed as their salvation. The moral clarity that had cost her career was suddenly valuable again because traditional military approaches had failed. "I'm a disgraced former officer with an other than honorable discharge," Sarah pointed out. "I have no authority, no clearance, no standing to participate in military operations." "That can be changed," Martinez replied quickly. "Temporarily, for this specific mission. We can reinstate your rank and clearance on an emergency basis if you're willing to help." Sarah turned away from the table and walked to the window, looking out at the base where she had spent so many years of her life. Somewhere overseas, soldiers who had trusted her leadership were fighting for their lives. The same system that had cast her out was now admitting they needed her back, but only because their conventional approaches had failed catastrophically. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" she asked without turning around. "Lead a rescue operation," Martinez said simply. "Plan it, execute it, bring our people home. You'll have full tactical command and whatever resources you need. No interference from higher command, no second-guessing your decisions." The offer hung in the air between them like a challenge. Sarah could feel the weight of decision pressing down on her shoulders again, just as it had 6 months earlier in the desert when she chose conscience over orders. But this time, the choice wasn't about following commands versus protecting civilians. This time, it was about whether she was willing to risk everything again to save the soldiers who had once followed her into uncertainty and might need to do so again. Sarah turned back to face Colonel Martinez, her decision crystallizing with the clarity that had always marked her most important moments. "I want to speak with the families first. Davis, Johnson, all of them. They deserve to know what I'm planning." Martinez looked surprised by the request. "Captain, that's unusual. Family briefings typically happen after operations, not before." "Nothing about this situation is typical," Sarah replied firmly. "These soldiers followed my lead once before, and their families paid the price when I was discharged in disgrace. If I'm asking them to trust me again, their families have the right to know exactly what that means." 3 hours later, Sarah found herself in the base family center facing 12 anxious spouses, parents, and children. The room was heavy with tension and barely contained fear. Sarah recognized several faces from previous family events, people who had once welcomed her into their homes, and now looked at her with a mixture of hope and suspicion. Maria Davis, Sergeant Davis's wife, spoke first. "Captain Mitchell, they told us you volunteered to lead the rescue mission. After what happened before, after your discharge, why would you put yourself at risk for us again?" Sarah looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes individually. "Because your husband and the others followed me once when I made a difficult choice. They trusted my judgment even when it cost them. I can't guarantee success, but I can promise that I'll use everything I've learned, every mistake I've made, to bring them home." An older man, Private Johnson's father, cleared his throat. "My son wrote to me about what happened in the desert. He said you saved innocent lives that day, that following orders would have meant killing children. Is that true?" "Yes, sir," Sarah replied without hesitation. "The intelligence was wrong. Following orders would have resulted in civilian casualties with no strategic benefit. But it cost you your career," Maria Davis said softly. "And Now they want you back because they need you. How does that make you feel? Sarah considered the question carefully. Angry, if I'm honest. But not at your husbands, not at any of the soldiers who trusted me. I'm angry at a system that punishes moral courage and then asks for it back when convenient. But that anger doesn't change what I need to do now. Johnson's father nodded slowly. What do you need from us? Your permission to risk everything again, Sarah said simply. And your understanding that unconventional situations require unconventional solutions. I may have to make choices that look wrong from the outside, but are necessary for success. The families exchanged glances, engaging in the silent communication that military families develop over years of deployment stress and uncertain news. Finally, Maria Davis stood up and extended her hand to Sarah. Bring them home, Captain, she said. Whatever it takes. The next 18 hours were a blur of intelligence briefings, equipment requisitions, and mission planning. Sarah immersed herself in satellite imagery, local intelligence reports, and tactical assessments that painted a grim picture. Her former unit was trapped in a valley, surrounded by hostile forces who had clearly been planning this ambush for months. Major Thompson, the intelligence officer assigned to brief her, spread detailed maps across the conference table. The enemy has positioned themselves on all the high ground surrounding the valley. They have heavy weapons, including anti-aircraft missiles that have already taken down our helicopters. Every conventional approach has been anticipated and countered. Sarah studied the topographical maps, her mind automatically calculating angles of approach, sight lines, and defensive positions. The enemy had chosen their ground well, creating a killing field that neutralized most American technological advantages. What about the local population? She asked. Are there any friendly contacts in the area? Thompson hesitated before answering. That's complicated, Captain. The village where your unit made their controversial retreat 6 months ago is approximately 10 kilometers from the current position. Intelligence suggests some villagers may have been providing information to enemy forces. Sarah felt a chill of recognition. The connection wasn't coincidental. Her former unit was trapped in almost the exact area where her career had been destroyed. Someone had specifically chosen this location, knowing the psychological impact it would have on American forces and perhaps hoping to draw her back into the conflict. This is personal, she realized aloud. Someone wants me here. That was our assessment as well, Thompson agreed. The question is whether it's a trap for you specifically, or if they're using your history to manipulate our response. Sarah continued studying the maps, but her mind was working on multiple levels. The tactical challenges were significant, but not insurmountable. The real problem was that conventional military thinking had failed because the enemy understood and anticipated it. Success would require approaches that violated standard operating procedures and probably several regulations. General Patricia Hayes, the commanding officer who had ultimate authority over the mission, joined a briefing that evening. She was a small woman with silver hair and eyes that had seen too many difficult decisions. Sarah had served under her years earlier and respected her pragmatic approach to leadership. Captain Mitchell, General Hayes said, settling into a chair across from Sarah. I'm going to be direct with you. This mission is a long shot under the best circumstances. We're sending you in because conventional approaches have failed, but that doesn't mean we're confident in unconventional ones. Understood, Mam Sarah Ripid. What are my parameters? Broad, Hayes admitted. Bring our people home alive, if possible. Minimize additional casualties. Don't create an international incident that destabilizes the entire region. Beyond that, you have tactical discretion to do whatever you think is necessary. The weight of that authority was both liberating and terrifying. Sarah had been trained to follow orders within established doctrine. Now, she was being given essentially unlimited latitude to improvise in a situation where lives hung in the balance. I'll need a small team, Sarah said. People who can think outside standard procedures and won't hesitate to follow unconventional orders. Anyone specifically? Hayes asked. Master Sergeant Kate Murphy from Special Operations, Lieutenant Chris Park from Intelligence, Staff Sergeant Tony Rodriguez from my former unit. Sarah paused. And I want civilian clothes, not uniforms. General Hayes raised an eyebrow. You're planning to go in disguised? I'm planning to go in smart, Sarah corrected. Uniforms make us targets and limit our options. If we're going to succeed, we need to be unpredictable. The team Sarah assembled was small, but capable. Murphy was a 15-year veteran with experience in dozens of covert operations. Park spoke 3 local dialects fluently and had spent months in the region building intelligence networks. Rodriguez had volunteered specifically for the mission, saying he owed Sarah for keeping him alive during their previous deployment. The plan is simple in concept, but complex in execution, Sarah explained to her team during their final briefing. We're not going in as soldiers trying to fight our way out. We're going in as people trying to help other people survive. That means we blend with the local population, use their knowledge and support systems, and avoid direct confrontation whenever possible. Murphy looked skeptical. Captain, that sounds like we're going in unarmed and hoping for the best. We're going in prepared for violence, but not dependent on it, Sarah clarified. Every previous rescue attempt failed because they relied on superior firepower and technology. The enemy was ready for that. They're not ready for us to disappear into the local population and emerge only when we choose. The helicopter insertion took place before dawn, depositing Sarah's team 15 kilometers from the target area. They carried minimal equipment, basic medical supplies, emergency rations, communications gear, and enough ammunition for a brief firefight, but not a sustained battle. Their success would depend on avoiding detection, not outgunning the enemy. The first challenge came immediately. Local shepherds discovered their landing site within an hour, forcing Sarah to make a crucial decision about whether to treat them as potential threats or potential assets. Rodriguez, you speak with them, she ordered. Tell them we're here to help people who are trapped, not to fight anyone. Ask if they know about the soldiers in the valley. The conversation lasted nearly 10 minutes, with Rodriguez translating carefully between languages and cultural concepts that didn't always align. Finally, he turned back to Sarah with a mix of hope and concern on his face. Captain, they know about our people, but they also say the area is controlled by fighters who have been planning something big for months. The good news is that some villagers are unhappy with the fighters because they've been demanding food and supplies. The bad news is that anyone who helps Americans will be killed along with their families. Sarah processed this information quickly. The enemy had local support, but not necessarily local loyalty. Fear was keeping the population compliant, but fear could be overcome if they believed help was coming. Ask them if they know safe paths through the valley, routes that avoid the main fighting positions, she instructed Rodriguez. The shepherds exchanged nervous glances before one of them began drawing in the dirt with a stick. The map he created showed a complex network of animal trails and seasonal watercourses that crisscrossed the valley floor. Most importantly, it revealed a pattern to the enemy positions that satellite imagery had missed. They say the fighters mostly watch the roads and hilltops during the day, Rodriguez translated. But they move around at night, using some of the same trails to bring in supplies and rotate personnel. There are windows when certain areas are unguarded. Sarah studied the crude map carefully, cross-referencing it with her mental picture of the terrain. A plan was beginning to form, but it would require precise timing and considerable risk. More importantly, it would require the team to separate and operate independently for extended periods. Here's what we're going to do, she announced to her team. Murphy, you're going to work your way around to the eastern approach and establish an observation post. I need to know exactly when and how the enemy moves through their rotation schedule. Park, you're going to make contact with friendly villagers and establish a support network. Rodriguez, you're coming with me to make direct contact with our trapped unit. Murphy frowned at the plan. Captain, splitting up violates every principle of small unit tactics. If any of us gets compromised, we won't be able to provide mutual support. Standard small unit tactics are why the previous rescue attempts failed, Sarah pointed out. We're not fighting a conventional enemy using conventional terrain. We're operating in a complex cultural and political environment where relationships matter as much as firepower. The team spent the rest of the day moving carefully through the mountainous terrain, using the routes suggested by the shepherds, and avoiding the obvious paths that would attract enemy attention. The physical demands were significant, but Sarah found herself energized by the challenge and the sense of purpose that had been missing from her civilian life. As evening approached, they reached the overlooked position that would allow them to observe the valley where her former unit was trapped. Through binoculars, Sarah could see the defensive positions her soldiers had established, a cluster of buildings that provided some protection, but no easy escape route. "They're still alive," Rodriguez observed with relief. "I can see movement in the buildings." Sarah studied the enemy positions surrounding her soldiers. The hostile forces had established a methodical siege with overlapping fields of fire that would prevent any direct assault or evacuation attempt. But the siege also revealed weaknesses, supply lines that needed protection, communication networks that could be disrupted, and dependence on local cooperation that might be exploited. They're waiting for something, Sarah realized. This isn't just about killing our soldiers. They want something else. Park, who had been monitoring enemy communications through his equipment, looked up from his radio. "Captain, I'm picking up chatter that suggests they're planning some kind of propaganda event. They want to capture our people alive and use them for a public demonstration." The implications were chilling. A public execution or show trial would be a devastating propaganda victory for the enemy and a humiliating defeat for American forces. But it also meant that Sarah's soldiers were being kept alive for a reason, which provided a narrow window of opportunity. "How long before their planned event?" Sarah asked. "Unclear, but the communications suggest it's soon," Park replied. "Maybe 48 hours at most." Sarah felt the familiar weight of decision settling on her shoulders. 2 days to plan and execute a rescue operation that had already defeated multiple conventional attempts. 2 days to save 12 soldiers whose lives depended on her ability to think beyond military doctrine and find solutions that no one else had considered. But this time, she wasn't acting alone. She had a team of experienced operators who understood that success would require innovation and risk-taking. More importantly, she had learned from her previous mistakes and understood the broader context of the conflict they were entering. "All right," she announced to her team. "We're not going to rescue our people. We're going to disappear them." Murphy looked confused by the distinction. "What's the difference, Captain?" "A rescue implies taking them by force from a position of strength," Sarah explained. "That's what the enemy expects and what they're prepared to counter. But if our people simply vanish without explanation, it creates confusion and forces the enemy to react instead of execute their plan." The strategy was unconventional and risky, but it played to their strengths while avoiding the enemy's prepared defenses. Sarah spent the rest of the night refining the details, incorporating local knowledge and cultural factors that conventional military planning typically ignored. By dawn, she had a plan that violated numerous military regulations but offered the best chance of success given the circumstances. The next 24 hours would determine whether her unconventional approach could succeed where traditional tactics had failed and whether the trust her soldiers had placed in her months earlier would prove justified in their darkest hour. The plan began at midnight with Park making contact with Amira, a village elder who had secretly opposed the fighters occupying her community. Through careful negotiation and promises of future protection, Park convinced her to provide crucial intelligence about enemy patrol schedules and the location of hidden supply caches. The fighters' trust no one completely, Amira explained through Park's translation. They move their guards every few hours, but they always keep the same path to their weapons storage. If something happened to those weapons, they would have to choose between guarding your soldiers and protecting their supplies. Sarah absorbed this information while studying her hand-drawn tactical map. The enemy's strength was their prepared positions and heavy weaponry. But heavy weapons required ammunition, and ammunition required secure storage and regular transport. Disrupting their supply chain would force them to make choices that created vulnerabilities. Rodriguez, can you get close enough to our people to establish communication without being detected? She asked. Rodriguez studied the terrain through his night vision scope. Maybe. There's a drainage culvert that runs along the eastern side of their position. If I can reach it during the guard rotation, I might be able to signal them. What kind of signal? Sarah wanted to know. Remember the tactical hand signals we developed during training? Rodriguez suggested. Davis and Johnson would recognize those immediately. I could use a red-filtered flashlight to send basic messages. Sarah nodded approvingly. Direct radio communication was too risky because the enemy was certainly monitoring all frequencies. But visual signals using their unit's specialized code would be recognizable to her soldiers while appearing meaningless to hostile observers. Murphy's voice crackled through their secure communication system. Captain, I've got eyes on the weapons cache. 2 guards rotating every 90 minutes. The storage facility is basically a reinforced cave with a heavy door. If we could get explosives inside, it would eliminate their heavy weapons advantage. Negative on explosives, Sarah replied immediately. Too much risk of civilian casualties, and the blast would alert every fighter in the valley. We need something more subtle. Park looked up from his communication with local contacts. Captain, Amira says the fighters have been demanding fuel from the villages for their generators and vehicles. What if we contaminated their fuel supply instead of destroying their weapons? Sarah considered the suggestion carefully. Contaminated fuel would disable vehicles and generators without creating the massive explosion that would endanger civilians. More importantly, the effects would be delayed, allowing her team to complete their mission before the enemy realized what had happened. What kind of contamination? She asked. Sugar, sand, water, anything that would damage engines without creating immediate obvious effects, Park explained. The local mechanics know tricks for making fuel unusable. They've been forced to maintain the fighters' equipment, so they understand exactly how to sabotage it. The psychological warfare aspects were as important as the tactical ones. By working through local allies, Sarah's team was demonstrating that the occupying fighters could be resisted successfully. Every small act of sabotage would encourage more local resistance and make the enemy increasingly paranoid about their support systems. Rodriguez reached the drainage culvert at 2 in the morning during the brief window when enemy guards were changing positions. Using his red-filtered flashlight, he began sending carefully coded messages to the building where his fellow soldiers were trapped. The response came almost immediately, a series of reflected light signals from a mirror or piece of metal that spelled out tactical information in their specialized code. Davis was still in command of the trapped unit. They had 2 wounded soldiers, but everyone was still alive. Their ammunition was low, but they had improvised defensive positions that could hold for another day if necessary. Most importantly, they were ready to move if given the opportunity. Tell them to be ready for emergency extraction in 6 hours, Sarah instructed Rodriguez through their communication system. No advance warning, no preparation time. When the signal comes, they have 30 seconds to move or the opportunity disappears. Rodriguez transmitted the message and received acknowledgement. Sarah's former soldiers were demonstrating the trust and discipline that had made them effective under her previous command. They would be ready when she needed them to be ready, without questions or hesitation. Meanwhile, Park's network of local allies was implementing their sabotage operations throughout the valley. Fuel supplies were being contaminated with materials that would gradually damage engines. Communication lines were being subtly compromised to create intermittent failures. Supply routes were being made unreliable through carefully placed obstacles that appeared to be natural rockfalls or washouts. The psychological impact is already visible, Park reported. The fighters are becoming suspicious of each other, and increasingly harsh with the local population. That's making more villagers willing to provide information and assistance. Sarah monitored these developments while finalizing her extraction plan. The key was creating multiple simultaneous distractions that would force the enemy to divide their attention and react to threats from unexpected directions. When a moment came, her soldiers would have seconds to escape during the confusion. Murphy had identified the optimal moment for action, a brief period just before dawn when guard rotations overlapped and visibility was poor due to morning mist. During this window, she would create a diversion at the weapons cache while Park's allies implemented their sabotage operations throughout the valley. The diversion doesn't need to be dramatic, Sarah explained to her team during their final briefing. It just needs to be confusing and require immediate attention. Murphy, I want you to trigger their perimeter alarms at multiple locations simultaneously. Make them think they're under coordinated attack from several directions. At 4 in the morning, the operation began with Park's allies implementing their final sabotage activities. Vehicles throughout the valley suddenly developed engine problems as contaminated fuel reached critical systems. Communication equipment began failing due to damaged connections. Supply convoys found their routes blocked by obstacles that would take hours to clear. Murphy initiated the diversion by activating motion sensors and tripwires around the weapons cache, creating the impression of a coordinated assault on their most important facility. Emergency alarms echoed throughout the valley as confused fighters responded to multiple simultaneous alerts. Sarah and Rodriguez moved toward the extraction point during the initial confusion, using the chaos to approach their trapped soldiers undetected. The enemy was focused on protecting their weapons and investigating security breaches, leaving their siege positions temporarily undermanned. The signal for extraction came at exactly 4:30, delivered by Rodriguez's red flashlight in a pattern that meant immediate emergency movement. Through her binoculars, Sarah watched as her former soldiers executed a perfect tactical withdrawal from their defensive positions, moving in coordinated pairs toward the extraction point while maintaining security and helping their wounded comrades. The extraction itself took less than 3 minutes. Sarah's soldiers emerged from their defensive positions during a gap in enemy observation, moving through the carefully planned route that avoided known hostile positions. They carried their wounded teammates and essential equipment while maintaining the discipline and coordination that had characterized their previous service under Sarah's command. This way, Sarah whispered as they reached the drainage culvert that would provide concealed movement away from the valley floor. Stay low, maintain interval, watch for my signals. Sergeant Davis, her former subordinate who had followed her controversial retreat order 6 months earlier, paused briefly when he saw Sarah in civilian clothes leading the extraction. "Captain," he whispered with obvious relief and gratitude. "I knew you'd come back for us." Sarah felt a surge of emotion, but maintained her focus on the immediate tactical situation. "Save the reunion for later, Davis. We're not clear yet." The movement through the drainage system was physically demanding and psychologically tense. The wounded soldiers required assistance, slowing their pace and increasing their vulnerability if discovered. Enemy forces were actively searching for explanations to the night's confusing events, and discovery would mean immediate engagement with superior numbers in unfavorable terrain. But Park's psychological warfare campaign was providing unexpected benefits. The contaminated fuel had disabled most enemy vehicles, preventing rapid pursuit or reinforcement. The sabotage communications were creating coordination problems between different hostile units. Most importantly, the general confusion was making enemy commanders reluctant to commit their remaining resources to pursuit operations when they weren't certain about the scope or nature of the threat they faced. Sarah's team reached the rally point at dawn, where Murphy was waiting with transportation arranged through their network of local allies. The vehicles were civilian trucks driven by villagers who had finally decided that supporting the rescue operation was worth the risk of enemy retaliation. The fighters are focused on securing their remaining weapons and restoring communications, Murphy reported. They know something happened, but they're not sure what. Some of them are convinced they were attacked by a large special operations force. Sarah helped load the wounded soldiers into the trucks while maintaining security watch for pursuing enemies. The success of the operation depended not just on extracting her people, but on getting them safely to the pickup point where American helicopters would be waiting. The drive through mountain roads was tense, but uneventful. The enemy's communication problems were preventing coordinated pursuit, and their vehicle failures had eliminated their main advantage in mobility. By the time hostile forces had organized an effective response, Sarah's convoy was already approaching friendly territory. The helicopter extraction site was a flat area near the Pakistani border where American forces could operate with minimal political complications. Sarah's wounded soldiers were immediately transferred to medical helicopters while the rest of her team prepared for extraction aboard transport aircraft. Colonel Martinez was waiting at the landing zone, his face showing relief and something that might have been admiration. As Sarah climbed out of the helicopter, still wearing civilian clothes and carrying equipment that had never appeared on any military inventory, he approached her with obvious questions about her unconventional methods. "Captain Mitchell," he said formally, "mission accomplished. All personnel recovered alive with minimal additional casualties. How did you do what 3 previous operations couldn't achieve?" Sarah looked back at her soldiers, who were being reunited with medical personnel and beginning their journey home to families who had trusted her with their lives one more time. "We stopped trying to fight their war and started solving the actual problem," she said simply. The debriefing process took 3 days and involved officers from multiple levels of command who wanted to understand how Sarah's unconventional approach had succeeded where traditional tactics had failed. Her methods had violated numerous regulations and procedures, but the results spoke for themselves. General Hayes conducted the final interview personally, reviewing Sarah's tactical decisions and their outcomes with the thoroughness of someone trying to extract lessons for future operations. "Captain, your success was undeniable, but your methods were highly irregular," Hayes observed. "Working with local civilians, operating without proper authority, using sabotage instead of direct action. None of that appears in our standard operating procedures." "Standard operating procedures assume we're fighting conventional enemies using conventional tactics," Sarah replied. "When the enemy adapts to our procedures, we need to be willing to adapt beyond them." Hayes leaned back in her chair, considering the broader implications. "The question is whether your approach can be systematized and taught, or whether it depends on individual initiative that can't be replicated." "Respectfully, ma'am, I think that's the wrong question," Sarah said. "The right question is whether we're willing to admit that moral courage and tactical innovation are more important than rigid adherence to doctrine when lives are at stake." The conversation that followed lasted for hours, covering not just the immediate rescue operation, but the broader questions about military culture, decision-making authority, and the relationship between individual judgment and institutional control that had led to Sarah's original discharge. 3 weeks later, Sarah received official notification that her discharge had been reversed and her rank restored retroactively. The Army offered her a new assignment with promotion opportunities and a chance to help develop new training programs based on her unconventional approaches to crisis situations. But Sarah's perspective on military service had changed fundamentally during her months in civilian life. She understood now that her value as an officer wasn't just in following orders or adhering to established procedures. Her value was in her willingness to make difficult decisions based on moral clarity and tactical innovation, even when those decisions conflicted with institutional expectations. "I'll accept reinstatement on one condition," she told Colonel Martinez during their final meeting. "I want to work on developing training programs that teach officers how to think beyond doctrine when doctrine isn't sufficient. We need leaders who can adapt to unexpected situations, not just execute predetermined plans." Martinez smiled for the first time since Sarah had known him. "Captain, I think the Army would benefit from that kind of training program, and I think you're exactly the right person to develop it." The assignment that followed challenged Sarah in ways that traditional military roles never had. She worked with combat veterans, military historians, and civilian experts to create training scenarios that forced officers to confront the gap between textbook solutions and real-world complexity. Her students learned about the mission that had led to her disgrace and the mission that had redeemed her career. But more importantly, they learned about the moral and tactical thinking that connected both experiences, the willingness to prioritize human lives over institutional convenience, and the courage to accept responsibility for decisions that couldn't be justified through regulation references. Sergeant Davis, who had been promoted after the rescue operation, often spoke at Sarah's training sessions about what it meant to serve under a leader who valued conscience as much as competence. Captain Mitchell taught us that following orders isn't the same as doing what's right, Davis would tell new officers. And she showed us that a leader's job isn't to make decisions that are easy to explain. It's to make decisions that serve the people who trust you with their lives. Sarah's career never returned to the conventional path she had originally envisioned. But her influence on military training and leadership development extended far beyond anything she could have achieved through traditional advancement. Officers who trained under her programs carried her emphasis on moral courage and tactical innovation to assignments around the world, creating a network of leaders who understood that effective military service required both institutional loyalty and individual judgment. Years later, when other military leaders faced similar choices between orders and ethics, many of them would remember the story of the officer who was discharged in shame and returned to save them all. Her example demonstrated that true military leadership sometimes required the courage to stand alone, and that redemption came not from institutional forgiveness, but from the willingness to risk everything again for the people who depended on your judgment. The lesson wasn't that rules and procedures were unimportant, but that they were tools rather than masters. When those tools were insufficient for the challenges at hand, effective leaders needed the wisdom to look beyond them and the courage to accept responsibility for doing what was necessary rather than what was expected. Sarah's office wall eventually displayed 2 commendations that told the complete story of her military service. The first recognized her courage in prioritizing civilian lives over tactical advantage during her controversial retreat. The second honored her innovation and leadership during the rescue operation that had brought 12 soldiers home alive. Between them hung a simple frame containing a handwritten note from Maria Davis. Thank you for teaching us that some things are more important than following orders, and for showing us that the best leaders are the ones willing to sacrifice everything for what's right. Sarah read that note every morning before beginning her work training the next generation of military leaders. It reminded her that true military service wasn't about personal advancement or institutional approval, but about the willingness to bear the weight of decisions that protected people who couldn't protect themselves. The Army had discharged her in shame for making a choice based on moral clarity rather than institutional compliance. But she had returned not to prove her loyalty to the institution, but to demonstrate that military service at its best required leaders who valued human dignity above personal security and were willing to risk their careers to save lives rather than follow convenient orders. Her story became a case study in military ethics courses, not because it provided easy answers, but because it illustrated the complexity of real leadership in situations where doctrine and morality diverged. Future officers learned that effective military service sometimes required the courage to stand against institutional pressure, and that redemption came through service to others rather than submission to authority. The 12 soldiers she had brought home alive went on to their own successful careers, many of them carrying forward the leadership principles she had demonstrated during their darkest hours. They understood that military effectiveness required both tactical competence and moral courage, and they taught their own subordinates that following orders was important, but protecting human dignity was essential. Sarah's legacy wasn't the conventional military success story of steady advancement through predictable achievements. Instead, It was the more complex narrative of a leader who had been willing to sacrifice her career for her principles and had found redemption through service to others rather than service to institutional expectations. Her training programs continued to influence military leadership development long after her retirement, creating generations of officers who understood that true military service required the wisdom to know when rules were sufficient and the courage to act beyond them when human lives demanded more than institutional procedures could provide.